Welcome to Law Sessions. I am Jennifer Housen. In this law session on public law, we will explore electoral law. In particular, we will look at the franchise, meaning your right to vote, and we will look at basically what is required when you look at the ability to vote, but more or less the things that tend to be important in this area, certainly when you're preparing at undergraduate level and for an exam, is you have to consider, the two main things to consider, public funding for electoral parties, and certainly looking at different ways of voting, different types of voting systems. If you're ever to get a question in an exam, those are generally the two examinable topics. What are the voting systems and how is funding, political funding, operating within the UK? Right then, well, let's start off with the franchise and the whole idea of elections. Well, within the franchise, the idea is statute determines whether a person is entitled to vote. So under Section 1 of the Representation of the People Act 1983, as of course substituted by Section 1 of the Representation of the People Act 2000, it sets out, of course, who is entitled to vote. So there's your minimum requirements there. Now, the electoral system, when you look at the electoral system, there are certain essential requirements to take on board. The franchise, the idea of equal value of votes, proper conduct of elections, and of course an effective voting system. So when you look at questions on electoral law, as I say, it does pick up on that theme. It looks at generally electoral systems and also political party funding. These are important, not least because when you consider the voting setup, and we will take a look at the last election in the UK and how the votes were distributed. But one of the things that an election is supposed to do, or voting arguably supposed to do, is to ensure that you have a fair electoral system. The question, of course, is the voting system as it currently stands in the UK fair? And if it is not, what are the alternatives? Okay? So, when you look at examples of voting system, when you look at the various systems, there are two requirements that are important for a voting system. Does the system produce a legislative body which is representative of the electorate? And secondly, does it produce a government with sufficient support to be able to govern effectively? Well, in the UK, you have the first past the post system. And you will tend to find that, again, quite a few of the Commonwealth countries have this system. And in a nutshell, the first past the post is really who wins the most votes will certainly rule. The problem with that, of course, is that you may very well be in the minority, and we will discuss that. You may very well be in the minority, but still be able to form the government. And what I mean by that is this. Let's assume we have a country, and let's assume in that country you have constituency A, B, C, and D. And let's assume that in constituency A, you have 20,000 voters. In constituency B, you have 20,000 voters. In constituency C, you have 20,000 voters. And in constituency D, you have 100,000 voters. The problem is that if you look at the first past the post system, you've just had an election where there are 3 seats in respect of only 60,000 people with one seat being for 100,000 persons being represented. So you have one representative for 100,000 people, but 3 for 60. And that's one of the problems with the first past the post, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the party with the most votes in terms of seats is the party with the most votes in terms of persons. And that has happened in the past. Indeed, when you look at the 97 election with the Labour Party, it appeared that the popular vote, number of persons vote, actually went to the Conservatives, but the Labour Party got the most seats. We will also see the interesting conundrum as it relates to the last election in 2010. So the first past the post is where you have the person who gets the majority of the seats, wins the election, rules the country. Now then, there are others. So for example, there's the alternative vote system, where you're looking at a majoritarian type of system, where you have a majority in terms of majority of persons making a selection. There's a single transferable vote system, and we will look at that in some depth. The party list system, and there are other mixed systems such as the additional member system. And I would urge you to look at them, because the point is, the one downfall of the first past the post is precisely what I've flagged up in my hypothetical, is that you could have a situation where you win the popular vote but lose the elections simply because of how the boundaries have been drawn. Well, over the past 30 years, and especially since 97, the UK's electoral arrangements have been more diverse, with greater use of systems other than the first past the post, as well as some recourse to referendums. In fact, interestingly enough, the recent election in the UK, where they voted for police commissioners, they used the single transferable vote, where they selected, the selection was you put in a number. So you selected your first choice and then you selected a second choice. And it meant, of course, that if your first choice didn't get through, then of course it get transferred to your second choice and so on. Again, I will go into that shortly. However, the recommendations of the Jenkins Committee 98 for the House of Commons to be derived from a mixed system of alternative vote and party lists was not very well received, and of course it didn't go any further. Now, if we start off, as I say, with what we already know, the first past the post, this is a kind of single winner takes all method of a system of voting. So what you get is you have a single winner. Of course, there are variants of these. Now, within this, we get a person who has the relative majority, and so where each voter votes for one choice, and the choice that receives the most votes wins. Even if it receives less than a majority of the votes, it wins. Now, when you look at the UK and the coalition government, in the last election, what we had was the Conservatives on something like 303, the Labour Party on 252. Now, the Lib Dems were holding 57 seats. So if the Lib Dems had joined with Labour, what you would have had was something like 57 plus 252, you're going to get what? 309, which would have been more than the Conservatives' 303. So the coalition could easily have been between the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. Now, in most Western democracies, they use some form of multiple winner voting system, with the United States and the UK being, of course, the main exceptions. Now, in a vote with multiple winners, such as the election of a legislature, it has different practical effects than a single winner vote. So often participants in a multiple winner election are more concerned with the overall composition of the legislature than exactly which candidates get elected. For this reason, many multiple winner systems aim for proportional representation, which means that if a given party or any other political groupings get, say, X% of the vote, it should also get approximately X% of the seats in the legislature. Now, not all multiple winner voting systems are proportional, but the idea here is this. When you look at the first past the post, which is, as I say, your simple majority, whoever gets the most votes wins and rules the house. But that may not be proportionally representative. The thing, of course, is there are advantages to the first past the post. Simply, you can know on the day who wins the election. You may have to wait a little bit more time, of course, when you're looking at, for example, a single transferable vote. So when you look at the first past the post, elections of MPs to the House of Commons are by the single member plurality system, which is first past the post. It is simple, cheap to operate, but of course there are defects. Party disproportionality is probable. Unrepresentativeness is a problem as well, because it can be unrepresentative, and that may of course weaken the legitimacy of the process and encourage disaffection. What you do see is that there has been a pretty low turnout. I mean, even when you look at the turnout in 2010, it only ranked about 65%, which appears high in the scheme of things. But first past the post has its problems. Is it truly representational? The argument is that it is not. So what is the suggestion? When you're making a discussion or you're putting forward proposals, you're making proposals, you start off by looking at the first past the post, which allows for the majority. But then you need to then move on to look at other systems to see whether or not they're better than what currently obtains. Other voting systems allow for proportional representation. The main one, of course, is the alternative vote when you're looking at a majoritarian system. There are variants of this. So, for example, the supplementary vote, the second ballot single transferable vote, the party list system, and as I've mentioned, the mixed system. Now, if you want to focus on proportional representation, the strength of it is that it at least appears as if your voice is being heard and your vote is not wasted. What I want us to examine are some proportional representation systems of voting, and we will take a short break, and as soon as we return, we will continue and look at those alternative systems.